What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast for another in-depth episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I started this quote-unquote series within a series in-depth about 2-3 weeks ago. I've done a few episodes of it where basically I dedicate a large portion of the show to one particular topic, one that I have a real broad opinion of, one that I can kind of just dive into and paint a big picture rather than, a 20-minute, 25-minute take. This will probably be a 30, 35-minute take. And I've greatly enjoyed these episodes because it allows me to just speak freely and speak my mind and just dive into the subject at hand, which in this case is none other than UFC lightweight, welterweight, gangster weight, whatever you want to call it, Nate Diaz. And we've talked about the card multiple times. UFC 241 takes place this Saturday night, live on pay-per-view, on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. So if you do not have ESPN Plus, you will not be able to get the pay-per-view unless you're watching it at, Buffalo Wild Wings or Dave & Buster's or somewhere. Or if your buddy has ESPN Plus, you can go over to his house and watch it there. But that's something that I want to let, the people know, is that for the people that don't often buy the pay-per-views, they might watch the fights on TV or something like that, or maybe they're new to the UFC and they want to really see this card for the obvious reasons that there are to see this card. You would have to get it through ESPN Plus. And I think that ESPN, the whole ESPN Plus thing, has been somewhat of a double-edged sword for me because on one hand, I think it's pretty awesome that the UFC is on ESPN, the main sports channel. It always has been, always will be. And I like that, but I don't like the fact that the pay-per-views, in order to get the pay-per-view, you have to have ESPN Plus. That's kind of annoying, but whatever. That's the day and age that we live in. Streaming is king. It is what it is, and we'll just go from there. We'll just make the best of it, as I guess we could say. So last night I was actually supposed to record this episode, but I went to the Buffalo Bisons game instead in downtown Buffalo. It wasn't a matter of instead. It was my buddy had a free ticket, hadn't seen those guys in a little bit, and I wanted to go to a baseball game. I figured it would probably be my last baseball game of the summer. So maybe not. Maybe there'll be another one in the future, but wanted to take that game in, and the Bisons just wrecked shop. Yes, last night they won. I think it was 9-3. Don't even remember the score. The Bisons were just pouring it on, so that was pretty fun. The ball was flying out of the ballpark. It was a good time. So it's always fun to be in downtown Buffalo, take in the sights and scenes, fireworks, and all that stuff. Pretty good time. So all that being said, as I alluded to, UFC 241 this Saturday night, and for my money, this is probably one of the best UFC cards in recent memory. Not that the UFC has been putting out, complete stinkers. The Askren Masvidal card was a good one for obvious reasons. You had Holly Holm, Amanda Nunes, then you had John Jones and Thiago Santos. But I feel like this one's bigger. I feel like this one's better. I feel like DC versus Stipe, too, is a bigger fight than Jones versus Santos. I feel like the return of Nate Diaz puts this card on a whole new level, and then you add in who he's fighting. He's not fighting just some no-name guy. He's fighting a former champion at 155 pounds, former featherweight contender, and now UFC welterweight, a guy that's coming off a emphatic knockout victory over Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Anthony Showtime Pettis. So you have two really big fights, massive fights on this card. And then you have Paulo Costa versus Yoel Romero, which I would like to think that the winner of this fight might end up fighting for the title soon, in short order. And if they do, if it's Paulo Costa, I think he will get that title shot. If it's Romero, being that he's already had a few runs at Whitaker, I don't know if they'll give him the title shot immediately. And Romero kind of had his race. He ran his race, and I don't know if his title aspirations are quite worthy or there even. So we'll talk about that when the fight takes place on the post-fight show. But I want to dive into the return of Nate Diaz and go in depth with the return of Nate Diaz. So this is a hiatus. This is a return that is 3 years in the making. Nate Diaz's last fight was against Conor McGregor, the rematch, biggest fight in UFC history at the time. And it was a fight that was back and forth, fight that ultimately Nate Diaz lost via decision. And it was a close decision. It was a fight that is one of the best fights in UFC history. In fact, when the UFC did a countdown of some of the best fights in UFC history, I believe that was number one. I could be wrong on that, but I believe that fight was number one, if not number two. So the return of Nate Diaz has been a topic of discussion for a long time now. And if you go back to my show's history and dive into some of the podcasts that I've done on Nate Diaz, it's always been, when the hell is Nate Diaz going to come back? When the hell is Nate Diaz going to fight? It's been 3 years. 3 years is a long time in the sport of MMA. That's an eternity. So waiting for a fighter to come back within a 3-year time frame, it's tough. It's not easy. And when you wait that long for a fighter to come back, you start to lose interest, number one, and you also start to lose track of who you could kind of pinpoint Nate Diaz fighting. Who was there for Nate Diaz to fight? And when you have a situation like that, the divisions are so ever-flowing, ever-changing. You have to find that right opponent, and you run out of options. Well, thankfully, the 3-year hiatus kind of flowed the way that it did for the UFC welterweight division, so Nate Diaz wouldn't have to cut weight. And you have a guy that has fought at 155 that is now fighting at 170 in Anthony Showtime Pettis, so you could put a really entertaining fight between two gentlemen that love to stand and trade, that are two of the most willing strikers, I think, in the UFC. Two of, at least. Maybe not maybe not the two, but two of the most willing strikers in the UFC. So this is a very welcomed opponent for Nate Diaz. This is an opponent that will bring out the best in Nate Diaz, bring out the Nate Diaz that we want to see as fight fans. So as a fight fan, I'm very thankful that this is the fight that Nate Diaz is coming back to. This is the fight that I think makes the most sense for him, and this is a fight that makes a lot of sense for Anthony Pettis as well. Anthony Pettis is going to get the opportunity to make a lot of money on Saturday night. He's going to get the opportunity to be a fixture in MMA history, an opportunity to create more memories for fight fans, more than what he has already created in his career. Anthony Pettis has fought the who's who, win, lose, or draw. You look at the guys that he's actually fought, a remarkable list of opponents. And the same thing goes for Nate Diaz. So really, these guys have been on a collision course for quite some time, and you have two fighters that ultimately will entertain the fans, will make the fans get their popcorn, get their nachos, and get their eyes glued to the TV. So that's number one. Number two is that I watched a 40-minute long interview with Nate Diaz. Let me say that again. I watched a 40-minute long interview with Nate Diaz. So there has been this huge internal debate as to whether or not Nate Diaz is a star. Dana White, back in the day, a few years back now, 3-year hiatus adds even more years to that back in the day statement. Dana White said, Nate Diaz is not a needle mover. Nate Diaz is not a guy that we can promote. He's just not. And there was ever so slightly some validity to that statement at the time. because Nate Diaz had never fought someone that would bring out the best in him. And what I mean by that is not just the best inside the octagon, but the best outside the octagon as well. The persona, the attitude, everything that Nate Diaz can bring to the cage somewhat encompasses those two things, the persona and his attitude. When he carries that into the octagon for a big fight or for any fight, that was what would get the people to tune in. But when you have an opponent alongside Nate Diaz that really can promote, that really can go out and talk the talk like Conor McGregor could, that took Nate Diaz to a whole nother level, because you had two fighters that could talk trash equally and bring about this persona where it was highly believable that both guys could do what they were going to say that they what they were going to say that they were going to do. So that is a factor that I think has created Nate Diaz into this dynamo superstar. There's no doubt about it. Nate Diaz is a needle mover now. The 3-year hiatus, I could talk to 20 MMA fans, and we could talk about Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, and they would all say somewhere along the way in the conversation, where is Nate Diaz? We want to see Nate Diaz fight. Everyone wants to see Nate Diaz in there versus anyone. Line them up. Fighter A versus Nate Diaz. Fighter B versus Nate Diaz. Fighter C versus Nate Diaz. You get the point. Nate Diaz could fight a lamp and people would want to watch it. So if you're doubting now, Dana White, that Nate Diaz is a needle mover, do not doubt anymore. I guarantee that this pay-per-view will be the highest bought pay-per-view. I guarantee that this pay-per-view will have more pay-per-view buys than that of Jones versus Santos. And Jones versus Santos had not one but 2 title fights on the card, where this card only has 1 title fight. But the return of Nate Diaz will surpass that factor. Because to be quite honest, more people care, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people would agree with me on this, more people care about seeing the fighters fight against one another. Most people would say, let me preface my statements here, most people would say that they just want to see 2 fighters that they want to see fight one another. They don't care if there is a belt on the line. They don't care if there is a legacy. They don't care about that. Hardcore fans like me do. They care about any narrative heading into a fight. But casual fans really just want to see name A versus name B and just see some fireworks in that octagon. And that's what Nate Diaz brings every single time. Win, lose, or draw. Now, there were a lot of things that Nate Diaz said in that interview that I thought were very entertaining. Things like the UFC was trying to force me out. They were trying to take me out of commission, take me out of the fight world, take me out of the fight game, and do all these things that manipulated my career. And I just didn't want any part of it. He said that they were offering him fights that he knew that they knew he wouldn't accept. Fights against guys that were prelim. Now, I don't know if that's true. No one knows if that's true, but at one point, they did offer Nate Diaz a short notice welterweight title fight against Tyron Woodley, and he turned that down. So it's tough to say that Nate Diaz is telling the full truth. I think it's a half truth. Where why would Nate Diaz, in his position, coming off of a huge money fight with no title implications versus Conor McGregor, why would Nate Diaz fight in a title fight? I don't think Nate Diaz really cares about the belt. I think that there's fighters that do care about the belt, and then there's fighters that don't care about the belt. And I think Nate Diaz is far right, if you will, as far as not caring about the belt. He just wants to fight the guys that will bring the fight to him, the guys that he thinks are quote-unquote cool, as he said about Anthony Pettis. Pettis is a guy that most fans look at as a guy that will stand in there and fight. So if that's the cool thing, which it is, I agree with Nate Diaz on that statement. Most people would look at Habib and see that Habib is a great fighter. He's great at what he does, but are you really going to be as amped up to watch an Khabib Nurmagomedov fight as you are to watch an Anthony Pettis fight? No, you're not. And that has to do with the dynamic of wrestling within the sport, a dynamic that I know very well, but a dynamic that most fans don't want to know very well. I can't compare myself, my own fandom, to the fandom of other people. Other people look at that grappling dimension in the sport and they don't quite understand it yet because the sport is still very young and they just don't get it yet. They don't want to get it yet. They want to see guys swapping punches and kicks and elbows and clinch, all that. Clinch fighting with knees and all that stuff. They want to see tantalizing knockouts. And that has been the MO of combat sports since the dawn of time. People want to see guys get knocked out. People want to see guys go to war and get bloody and create a slobber knocker, if you will, in the words of Jim Ross. So, all that being said, where do I go from here? I watched this 40-minute interview with Brett Okamoto, and I think that Nate Diaz, during this hiatus, was waiting for the right opponent. He waits for the right opponent. Most people thought that he was waiting for Conor. I never thought he was really waiting for Conor per se, but I thought 70% waiting for Conor, 30% waiting for somebody that he knows will be an entertaining fight. And he got that. He got that 30% guy in Anthony Pettis. So, as I take my swig of water here, as we dive into the Pettis and Diaz fight now, as we dive into how I think this fight is going to go down, whether you are George St. Pierre, whether you are Dominic Cruz, and you've taken a 2, 3, 4-year layoff from the sport, the elite of the elite can always find a way to win. This is not Nate Diaz's first rodeo inside that octagon. He's fought the who's who inside the sport. This is not his first day at the office. This is actually, it's probably his 30th day, of what seems like it, 32nd day as a pro fighting inside the UFC octagon. His 32nd pro fight. Nate Diaz has been around, just to put this in perspective, Nate Diaz has been around in the UFC since 2006. 2006. Over a decade. So it's just another day at the office for him. Whether he's been gone for 3 years, 2 years, 1 year. People are talking about the 3-year layoff. No. The 3-year layoff will not matter. The 3-year layoff means nothing. Really means nothing. It's a cool narrative heading into the storyline of the fight, because we've been anticipating Nate Diaz's return for that long. But as far as how that 3-year layoff will affect Nate Diaz, it will not affect Nate Diaz at all. I guarantee it. I'd bet money on it, actually. That layoff will not hurt Nate Diaz. But what could hurt Nate Diaz is the leg kicks of Anthony Pettis. Nate Diaz keeps a lot of weight on that front leg. Conor McGregor exposed that. Rory McDonald had success with that in their fight. And I think Anthony Pettis is most definitely going to try to take advantage of that. Where this fight will get, dirty and really force these guys to bite down on their mouthpiece is the first, second round in between there. Because the first round, there's going to be a hellacious pace. First round, things are going to start off with fireworks quickly. Then there's going to be that little pause, that little break in between the first and second round. And how Anthony Pettis reacts to that pause within that first round will be the telltale sign of the fight. Because Nate Diaz is a guy that comes out really putting his foot on the gas pedal, so to speak, in that gap, in that break, coming out early within a second, third round, Nate Diaz is the last guy that I'd want to fight. First round, Nate Diaz has a tough time with a lot of opponents that he's fought. I don't know if it's just a notorious, pun intended, thing with him, but it appears like it is. It appears to be. Because in my memory bank, I've seen him have these tough experiences in the first round and then come back second, third, fourth, fifth. In that case of obviously fighting Conor, being that it was a 5-round main event, you know that, Nate Diaz is as tough as they come. So it's going to take a lot for Anthony Pettis to knock him out. I think a lot more than a jump off the cage Superman hook, which not to really take a lot from Anthony Pettis in that performance. It did happen. It was a knockout, but he was losing that fight prior to that punch, and it was a highly fluky, punch. Those punches do not happen in the average MMA fight. So I think Anthony Pettis is going to have some trouble fighting Nate Diaz. I think Nate Diaz might be a little bit too big for Anthony Pettis, and I think Anthony Pettis is fighting at his best weight at 170, as is Nate Diaz, but I think Diaz is going to win this one. I really do. Originally, I thought Pettis, but the more I watch tape, the more I check the tape, as Sean McDermott would say, the Bills head coach, I think that Nate Diaz is going to take this one. I really do. And the end-all, be-all dynamic of this Brett Okamoto interview that I found to be really entertaining is that Nate Diaz said that he wants to just fight the cool guys. And I mentioned that, but what exactly does that mean? If Nate Diaz wins this fight in devastating fashion, or if Nate Diaz just simply wins this classic brawl and he needs to fight, needs to finish out this contract. He's got 3-4 fights left on this UFC contract. So if that's the case, we know that Nate Diaz will probably have to turn around within the next 6 to 8 months at least. And if that's the case, I think a fight with Conor McGregor is on the horizon if Nate Diaz does win this fight versus Anthony Pettis. And I would highly expect that if Joe Rogan hands the mic over to Nate Diaz and he asks what's next for you, Nate Diaz is going to call Conor out. And that'll be the fight to make, because that's a fight that really everyone wants to see Conor fight Nate Diaz. I can't count many people on one hand that want to see Conor fight Khabib. I just don't get it. But I go through the resume of a Nate Diaz, and it's a resume that I think is very noteworthy. Very noteworthy. And Nate had a lot of questions for the fans. He said a lot of things as far as what the fans want, what the fans expect. The fans expected Nate to fight Dustin Poirier on November 3rd on that UFC NYC card, and Poirier pulled out. So Nate Diaz said, I look at that fight with Poirier as a win due to the fact that he signed on the line and he never fought me. I can't really disagree with that mindset. I like that mindset, that if a fighter signs on the dotted line, that he should finish. He should compete. Within the last 4 years, Nate Diaz has fought twice. Fought Michael Johnson in 2015. Fought Rafael dos Anjos in 2014. So within the last 5 years, he's fought 3 times. Fought Josh Thompson, lost in 2013. Fought Gray Maynard in 2013 as well. Won that one. That was a trilogy fight. Fought Jim Miller, submitted Jim Miller. Fought Benson Henderson for the lightweight title back in 2012. Lost that via decision. 2011, Rory McDonald, decision loss. 2011, he fought Takanori Gomi as well, submission first round. Later on in the year, he fought Donald Cerrone, and that was on the Brock Lesnar, Alistair Overeem card. I remember that. Remember that very well. 2011. Wow, 8 years ago. Nate Diaz fought Marcus Davis, Rory Markham. Obviously, as I said, he fought Gray Maynard twice. Nate Diaz fought Melvin Gillard, Joe Stevenson, Clay Guida. Lost via decision to Clay Guida. That's very interesting. Nate Diaz fought Alvin Robinson, Kurt Pellegrino, Josh Neer. Josh Neer was a very tough, experienced guy in that fight at that time. And you look at the fight stats from that fight, Nate Diaz threw a total of 157 strikes, landed 114 of them. He landed 72% of his strikes. Significant strikes, 55% of those strikes were landed, and also landed 5 out of 11 takedown attempts. Josh Neer did try 4 submission attempts. I want to go to Nate Diaz's fight with Donald Cerrone, which was in 2011. This performance, if you guys don't have UFC Fight Pass, just go to YouTube if you can and see if you can find it. The performance of Nate Diaz versus Donald Cerrone was one of the most dominant, one-sided ass whoopings I've ever seen in my UFC fandom. I've never seen a fighter beat another fighter pillar to post the way that Nate Diaz beat Donald Cerrone. Diaz threw a total of 391 strikes. He landed 260 of those strikes. Significant strikes, Diaz landed 238 out of 362. That's 65.8%. Cerrone landed a total of 96 significant strikes to Nate Diaz's 238. Cerrone's fought a lot more since then, obviously. Cerrone's fought quite a lot since then. You look at the records, too, like Nate Diaz is 19-11 and Donald Cerrone is 36-12. So you're like, wow, Cerrone's the way better fighter. It's just that Nate Diaz hasn't fought a lot in the last, as I said, 5 years, he's fought 3 times. In the last 5 years, Donald Cerrone has fought 3 times already this year, fought 3 times last year, fought 3 times in 2017, fought 3 times in 2016, fought 3 times in 2015, 3 times in 2014. I mean, how many fights is that? 20? That's ridiculous. So, I mean, obviously, I'm diving into that a little bit, end of it too. But I think the inactivity for Nate Diaz is a good thing because he took a lot of shots in the Conor McGregor fights. A lot of shots. And they were very hard punches. So I go to Conor McGregor fights. Conor fought Nate Diaz. And the first fight, Nate Diaz outstruck Conor. Not that many people realize that. But the first fight, for being a 2-round fight, is really... There's so many little minute details that I can take from that fight. The first round, Conor was so amped up, so ready to throw as many punches as he could at Nate. And Nate just said, I'm going to take what this guy's got, read him, see if I can get a gauge as to how I can figure this guy out. And if I can't figure him out, I'm in trouble. If I can, we're going to win this fight. And eventually he quickly figured him out because Conor's gas tank went from 100 to 0 with a snap of his fingers. and he was trying to backpedal, trying to get away from Nate, and Nate Diaz just sensed it, and you saw the volume just turn up to 100 with Nate Diaz. He just swarmed Conor, landed all these punches from a variety of different angles, and eventually Conor shoots for a takedown. Nate Diaz gets on top. Conor tries to roll underneath the submission on the guillotine. He rolls underneath, and then Nate Diaz stays on top of him, transitions to full mount. Conor gives Nate his back, and Nate chokes him out. Chokes him, taps him out, with his face on the mat. And Nate had a really interesting line in that Brett Okamoto interview. He said, "We got to do it again, essentially. We got to fight again. Me and Conor got to fight again because he can't be happy with the decision in the second fight." And I thought the same thing. I thought really that, I know Conor was the featherweight champ at the time, but that really meant nothing because we all know that Conor looked like death when he stepped on that scale for Chad Mendez in that featherweight title fight. He looked like death when he fought Aldo for that title fight. And after he fought Aldo, he looked pretty bad. Real small and real svelte and just not healthy. So that didn't even really matter. I thought that when Conor fought Nate the second time and Conor got that unanimous decision victory, or majority decision victory, I should say, that they would fight again right after that. I didn't think that there would be this odyssey. And what an odyssey it's been. I mean, for Nate Diaz, you're sitting on the sidelines. You have a trilogy match that everybody knows is coming eventually. Whether it's now or the next 3 years, that fight will happen. I know it will. But you're Nate Diaz, you're sitting on the sidelines, and you see this guy launch more of his career off of a win off of you, and you're not a star. That's very tough for me to understand, and it's obviously tough for Nate Diaz to understand. And I think that it's a dynamic that creates a very nasty, hostile situation between a fighter and his promotion that he fights for. I guarantee it had a lasting effect on the relationship between Nate Diaz and Dana White. I think that fight with Diaz and Conor will happen. I think it'll be the biggest fight, biggest main event, but maybe they want Conor to have a belt before they put that fight together again. Maybe they want Conor to come into that fight wearing a strap of some sort, but I think those days might be over. I mean, 145 if he maybe dropped back down and fought Max, but I don't think he's at that stage anymore where he wants to do that to himself. He doesn't have to. Conor McGregor doesn't even have to fight, let alone cut weight anymore, to that extreme. But I think the Nate Diaz-McGregor fight will happen. I think what would accelerate the chances of that happening is if Nate beats Anthony Pettis, takes that mic and calls out Conor. It's that simple. I think that would be an epic moment in the sport's history. Just like Nate provided the fans with other epic moments. The whole first fight, the whole second fight. Obviously, the soundbite where Joe Rogan says, "Nate Diaz, you just shook up the world. How do you feel?" And Nate Diaz says, "I'm not surprised, beep. That was awesome." Who didn't like that? Even Conor fans were like, "Okay, you got one. You got one, Nate. You got us. It is what it is. We'll come back. We'll get you." And who doesn't love a trilogy where you know that both guys are going to stand in there and fight? So this Pettis fight is really the title shot to the biggest money fight ever. If this isn't a title shot, it is a title shot for that. That's how I'm thinking right now. That's how I perceive this whole situation between Nate Diaz and the UFC. And Dana White's job has always been to put on the fights that the fans want to see. Who doesn't want to see Nate Diaz fight? Anybody? Am I losing my mind? Is there anybody out there that doesn't want to see Nate Diaz fight? Everyone wants to see Nate Diaz fight. Everyone is pumped for this pay-per-view. For obvious reasons, and most of them involve DC, Stipe, and Pettis, and Diaz. Those are two great fights. I can't wait for this pay-per-view. I really can't. I am so stoked for it. Nonetheless, that brings an end to our journey here on another episode of Thomas Take in Depth. Nate Diaz. Very pumped up for this pay-per-view, obviously. I think that MMA fans are in for a real massive night of fights. A lot of awesome memories will be made watching these fights, I think. And I hope you enjoyed my show. I hope you enjoyed my take on it. I hope you enjoyed my prediction. I think Nate Diaz is going to win this fight. Originally, I did think that Pettis would win it, but watching the tape, man, I really think Nate's going to take this one. Join the takeover, everybody. Follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. Also, Instagram, Ryan Thomas Take. Also, like the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page. And I'll see you soon. Post-fight reaction, Sunday, August 18th. Can't wait.